Hello, I'm Carolyn Otley and I'm the Community Resilience Coordinator. I work for Cumbria CVS, which is a voluntary sector organisation, but I work across all the partners of Cumbria's Local Resilience Forum. And although my focus is on community resilience, I'll be talking about all aspects of emergency preparedness and response. What we'll be covering today, well, we're going to do a run through why we need to prepare, who coordinates emergency planning and response, but mainly we'll be focusing on some of the key developments over the last few years. And I'll then try and talk about how it all comes together in practice and some of the new developments we know are coming soon. We'll then have a pause for questions and a chance for people to share their perspectives on the topics we've covered. So why do we need to prepare? This is kind of obvious, but I think it's really obvious, also really obvious to us that after somewhere's flooded, people are much more interested, quite understandably, in preventing future flooding rather than planning for the flooding that will happen. And so I suppose I want to go back to Stuart's slide as the key slide and just emphasise that we're talking about responding to flooding and planning for responding to flooding as part of that wider picture. The priority is to protect our communities from flooding, but we also need to be ready to respond. So, quick run through who coordinates emergency planning and response, and that's Cumbria's Local Resilience Forum. Cumbria Local Resilience Forum was formed in 2005 as a result of the Civil Contingencies Act the year before. And it's a partnership that brings together the organisations from across Cumbria to prepare for, respond to and recover from a range of different emergencies. And in Cumbria, one of those emergencies at the top of the risk register that we plan in detail for is flooding. Cumbria Local Resilience Forum is based on the police force area. So although Cumbria is undergoing local government reform, we'll keep a Cumbria-wide Local Resilience Forum beyond that point. There's a huge range of organisations involved in Cumbria Local Resilience Forum. This is just a selection of those logos. They couldn't possibly fit all of them onto one slide. But the Civil Contingencies Act defines a number of categories of responder. So we have Category 1 responders who have a set of responsibilities, and those are the obvious organisations involved in emergency response. It's the Blue Light Services, Police, Fire and Ambulance Service. It's the councils and it's the Environment Agency. We then have a range of Category 2 responders who tend to be the utilities providers and the transport network providers, and also a huge range of other organisations who aren't required to be part of local resilience forums, but are very much part of Cumbria's. And that includes the voluntary sector organisations, some specialist organisations like Mountain Rescue and Bay Search and Rescue, the British Red Cross, and Cumbria CVS as a link into the huge range of local voluntary sector organisations we have in Cumbria. And since I've been involved in Cumbria's Local Resilience Forum, which is really since the flooding caused by Storm Desmond in 2015, there's been a focus on a communities to COBRA approach. COBRA is the government's emergency committee, and there's been a real push in Cumbria to make sure that our communities are connected very closely into the strategic coordinating group that's set up in response to a major incident, and in that way into the COBRA committee. That's very much a two-way thing. It's about making sure that communities know what's going on and have good information to inform their response, but it's also about making sure that all that knowledge that's out there in our communities feeds into the strategic coordinating group and allows us to make much better decisions about how to respond during an incident. So on to the main part of the presentation, and that's some of the developments that have happened over the last few years. So I'll start with the national and regional development and a couple of websites it's well worth a look at. The Check for Flooding website is part of the gov.uk website, and it's a flooding that allows you to check where there are flood warnings, what the current river levels are, what rainfall's been like over the last few hours, and your flood risk over the next 5 days. And if you go onto that website, you can search for a location by a postcode, by the name of a community, or go onto a map and do it through the map, and I like maps. So the screenshot here is of what you'll see if you go on to check for flooding and look at a map. You can see there are a number of things you can check down the right hand side, which layers you want to see on the map. So I've chosen, unfortunately, a really boring time to take a screenshot of the map. But if there were flood warnings in place, you'd see those orange and red hatched areas on the map covering the areas that the flood warning covers. And if you click on one of the blue icons, you can see there we've got icons for rain gauges and icons for river level gauges. It will take you into all the information for that gauge. So if I was to click on a river level gauge, you'd end up with something like this. So this is the river levels at the River Derwent in Cockermouth. Again, I chose a really boring time to have a look at it, but you can see there the blue line is the river level over the last 5 days. And for this gauge, there's a forecast for the next 36 hours, which is the dotted line that continues beyond that blue line. And then you can put another number of straight lines on the map. So that straight line at 1.5 metres just above the blue line is the top of the normal range. And then the solid black line higher up is the level at which it's likely that flood warnings will be sent out. So it's a really useful website. It's probably best to just go on and have a play around with it. I find it really easy to navigate. It's been live for about a year now. And when you get onto this screen, it's really easy to click on the buttons to take you to the upstream gauge, the downstream gauge, or to go back to the map and find the other local gauges and rainfall gauges. The other website I'd like to talk about is the Flood Hub website, and this is a Northwest regional website. This is a website that was established after Storm Desmond. And it's got lots of information on it on how to prepare for flooding and how to recover after flooding. I'll show you a screenshot of the homepage in a minute, but it's got a set of tiles on it, and you can go into the appropriate set of information for households, for businesses, for landowners who have a river running through their property, and for schools, and loads more besides that. And I think what I like about the Flood Hub in particular is we get asked a lot how we get information to people who don't use the internet. The Flood Hub's great because it's got lots of fact sheets that are designed to download and print off, which are really easy to use with people who aren't going to go and look on a website for their information. So this is the homepage of the Flood Hub. It's best to go on and have a play around and work out what's on there. But there are a series of tiles on the homepage that take you in. The Flood Hub has really been growing in popularity over the last few years. You can see that the figures for the number of users over the last year there, and it's proved really popular. I think Newground, who run the Flood Hub, have had enquiries from lots of other regions in the UK who'd like their own Flood Hub website. And the latest inquiry came from Australia. Within Cumbria, there have also been a number of developments over the last few years, and I'll do a quick run through all of those. So there are new flood warning areas gone live for 12 communities in Cumbria. Have a look through those. Those are mainly smaller communities at the bottom of really fast reacting catchments. And I think some surprises in there. So communities like Grasmere and Ambleside that we know have flooded many times have only just got that flood warning. And of course, having the opportunity to sign up to receive flood warnings can make people much better prepared to respond when flooding happens. There's also been a big refresh of Cumbria's multi-agency flood plan. So Cumbria's Local Resilience Forum has had a flood plan for a long time, but over the last 18 months, it's had a big refresh to bring it in line with new national guidance. So we now have an overarching plan and then 52 local plans known as the Part 3s, and they cover all kinds of flooding. They cover river flooding, surface water and coastal flooding. And those Part 3s linked to the local community emergency plans where there's a plan in place. Last year, the Local Resilience Forum exercised a sample of those plans, and where there was a community group or an active parish council, that community was included in those exercises of the plan. So I think one of the big challenges in many types of incidents, but particularly in flooding, has been identifying the properties where there might be people who need extra help during an incident and making sure that those people get the help they need. And the Viper website is a way of identifying those more vulnerable people during an incident. So Viper takes this information that's available in existing organisations like social care, fire, and the utility companies' extra care registers, priority service registers, and it merges them into a single database that then goes out and generates either a map or a list of properties for responders on the ground to prioritise. So it helps those responders on the ground, which might be the fire service, might be the police, might be mountain rescue or a local community group, to know that when they're outdoor knocking, which properties have people living there that might require a bit more help and a bit more attention. So it's really hard to show this on a slide, but this is a screenshot of the Viper website that's still being developed. But basically what it's showing is you can go onto the map there, you can draw a polygon around the area you're interested in, and then the Viper system will generate a list of properties within that area that are most likely to need a visit and where people are most likely to need some help. Second local website I'd like to talk about is Support Cumbria, which is again a system that was developed after Storm Desmond, when we saw busloads of spontaneous volunteers coming to Cumbria to help our communities clear up after the flooding. I think that's a kind of an influx of volunteers that's really welcome, but it's a real challenge to coordinate those people. So Support Cumbria gives us a way to register those people online and to keep them in touch and keep them up to date, explaining when it would be most helpful to come and help and where we need them to go. It was due to go live about a month after the start of the pandemic, but we started it right at the start, and during the pandemic we registered over 2,000 volunteers, more than half of whom were matched to an opportunity, which compares really well with some of the national websites registering volunteers to help the NHS, for example, where sometimes only 10 or 15% of volunteers got matched to something. And then in the background of Support Cumbria, we're working on how we use that as a way of getting some of our communities and voluntary sector groups registered on there, which will give us a way to communicate with those groups during an emergency. So community resilience, which is my kind of favourite topic, is something that really wasn't very well known. When I started as the Community Resilience Coordinator 4 years ago, I kept having to explain what community resilience was, but through the pandemic, through Storm Arwen, I think it's become a term that's used a lot more by government and much more commonly known. That kind of increased visibility has meant there's been much more funding available to our community groups over the last few years, but all of those bits of funding have some restrictions attached to them. So there's been funding from public health through the Contain Outbreaks Management funding, including grants for community groups, a post with the parish councils and some work in Carlisle. There's now a fund from Electricity North West for the communities that were worst affected during Storm Arwen. There's funding for some specific communities through CIPHER, the Cumbria Innovative Flood Resilience Project, and there's public health funding available to the groups who are involved in supporting people through the cost of living crisis. And at a community level, it's many of the same groups who help with things like a cost of living crisis, help with a pandemic, and respond when their community floods. I think the real challenge now is to make sure that we have funding available to all the range of groups and that it's not just limited to those in a particular topic area. So how does it all come together in practice? I think we saw that last October during half term when Cockermouth was very close to flooding and a small number of properties did flood. I've taken these quotes straight from a presentation Joe Crozier from Cockermouth Emergency Response Group did to the Regional Flood and Coastal Committee a few months back, and I think mostly it went well. The things that particularly went well were SERG's ability to pump. They started pumping water and stopping homes flooded for several hours before any of the statutory agencies were able to help with pumping. The multi-agency coordination went really well. That photograph in the bottom right-hand corner is all the agencies sitting in the main room at Cockermouth Mountain Rescue Base, talking to each other, joining it up, and linking to Cockermouth Emergency Response Group, who were just down the hill. And then, obviously, the flood defences mainly worked, and that is a real what went well, and I think really reassured the community that they were better protected than they'd been previously. What could have been better? I think lots of the community groups have said they'd like earlier alerting by the Environment Agency in the early stages of flooding and a bit of a better feel for how likely they were to flood. And that's a tricky area because we know flood forecasts change really quickly. However, we've got some meetings coming up in the next month or two with Cockermouth Emergency Response Group and the Environment Agency to talk through that and to talk about how we can get better information out to the community groups earlier on. So what's coming soon? Just a few things to run through really quickly. There's now the possibility of sending out emergency alerts by cell broadcast. So in situations where life's immediately at risk, so the kind of thing where a severe flood warning might be sent out, it's possible to send a message out to all the mobile phones that are connected to cells in that area. So you don't need to have signed up in advance. If you're in the area and your mobile phone's connected to a mast there, you should get a text message that tells you about that flood warning. There'll be a new national resilience strategy that is almost ready and just waiting for sign-off that will contain a nice case study of some of the work that's happened in Cumbria. There's a new national security risk assessment that came out about 10 days ago now, and that defines at a national level the risks that we'll have to look at Cumbria and to plan for. But in terms of flooding, I really can't anticipate there are any major changes there. I think flooding is always going to be up the top of the risks that Cumbria is planning for. And then there are some local resilience forum flood training days going on to get people who might be involved at an operational or tactical level a bit better informed and practiced in using those flood plans. So the first of those flood training days took place in Kendal a week ago. There's one in Carlisle tomorrow, and there's one in Workington in a couple of weeks' time. And then just to finish off, I think we're expecting Keswick to run another community exercise in the spring. These are obviously not photographs of the exercise that will take place in March 2023 because we aren't there yet. These are photographs from the exercise that took place in the autumn of 2019 before the pandemic. And I think the great thing about the Keswick community exercises is they really do cover many layers of that, practicing that response. So down in the right-hand corner, you can see some postcards that Keswick Community Emergency Recovery Partnership put through the doors of every household in the flood area that reminded people to test their floodgates, to tell them how to get in touch with the group, to remind them to sign up for flood warnings. You can see down in the bottom left some of those volunteers from the Keswick Community Group practicing their roles in a flood incident, which is the main point of the exercise, but also up in the top right, some of the emergency response organisations, the police and the county council, practicing how they'd react and how they'd work with the community in a flood incident in Keswick. And then the photograph in the top left was around practicing the reception centre plans and getting some willing volunteers in this case my children, to go in and go through the registration process at a reception centre, so that the Borough Council staff who run that reception centre get a bit of practice there and know how to run that centre. So that's it for the presentation. We'll move on now, starting off with taking any questions on kind of clarification or the factual stuff, and then we'll have a chance to talk to each other about what other learning you want to share or what other perspectives there might be on what I've just said. Thank you very much, everybody.